Hello, everyone, and welcome to How to Make Stress Your Ally. My name is Susie DeVille, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Innovation and Creativity Institute. And I help entrepreneurs and visionary leaders connect with their creativity, home in on who they truly are, and unlock their entrepreneurial potential. And I'm also the author of Buoyant, the Entrepreneur's Guide to Becoming Wildly Successful, Creative, and Free. And I am so excited to be joined by the fabulous Dr. Robyne today. And I'm going to introduce her first and then let her start to share a little bit of her very intriguing story. Dr. Robyne Hanley-Dafoe is an award winning psychology scholar, resiliency expert, and author of Stress Wisely: How to Be Well in an Unwell World. What sets Dr. Robyne apart is how she learned resiliency from the ground up as a person who has experienced significant obstacles, yet forged her comeback. Dr. Robyne has over 18 years of university teaching and research experience and brings a refreshing and research informed perspective to our understanding and practices of resiliency and wellness. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Susie, for inviting me. I'm excited to spend time with you today.
Thank you. Well, I have to start first with this life defining moment when you were 16 years old that put you on this path to study human resiliency. Can you share a little bit about that?
Of course. So, as I think folks can relate, I was a teenager who had a pretty dark season of adolescence. My troubles really started actually in early years, but it would really manifested in adolescence. Pretty dark time. I was navigating a lot of mental health challenges, a lot of emotional challenges, and again, in an attempt to try to mitigate some of these complications I was trying to manage, developed a lot of maladaptive behaviors, a lot of habits that really hindered my success in being able to really kind of relate to people and be part of community. And I often share with folks, Susie, that when we're teenagers and we're struggling, we ask for help in all of the wrong ways. And that's very much what I did. I really got myself into a lot of trouble. And what was interesting is I actually, by grade 10, ended up dropping out of high school. I didn't feel as though I could manage or cope. And I had an experience, though, shortly after my family had moved to a new community, almost in an attempt to rally and really help me get back on track, a wee bit of an intervention. And I ended up experiencing a catastrophic car accident, and it nearly cost me my life. I was driving in a winter snowstorm. I was a very inexperienced driver. I lost control of that vehicle, and it plummeted into a frozen river, and I was trapped inside of a sinking car. And one of the things that was really evident in that moment, Susie, was all of a sudden you just kind of have these moments where you realize it's right now. Like what I do right now is going to essentially let me know whether I'm going to live or if I die or where it goes next. And in that moment, I was really aware of something my mother actually used to tell me, which was that even though I had gotten into a lot of trouble and a lot of mischief, that I always was able to figure things out. I was able to do hard things.
Mm.
I was able to get myself out of that vehicle, and I was rescued that night by a passerby who risked his life to save my life. He was actually awarded the highest award of bravery that is given in our country. And
Wow.
that very much was this turning point for me, where I wanted to figure out another way of showing up in my life, but also understanding what had got me there in the first place.
Wow. Amazing. So let's tie this very dramatic and nearly tragic event into how you now have transmuted this into tapping into repeatedly throughout your life, how you have transmuted this into resiliency, and how your passion evolved into studying this and then teaching this and sharing it in your books.
Yes. So part of my recovery program, a strategy in which we adopted to really help me get back on my feet again, was through education, was recognizing the importance of getting back into school, finding a sense of purpose, meaning, not necessarily in the events that had happened to me in adolescence, but I needed a driver, like something that was really going to give me direction that I could work towards. Because when you've been essentially rudderless and kind of spinning and spiraling, this idea that we have to get back on a path. And it's not that there's one perfect path or a right path. It was just this idea, like one milestone at a time. And for me and my family, we used education as those markers. So get back to school, finish school, apply to post-secondary school, go to post-secondary school. So we set these markers on that path of education. And I appreciated those opportunities. I was very successful. I was working at the university full-time by 27. Like I had this, really remarkable going from a high school dropout to university professor, in about 11 years. So that was a pretty substantive shift. But what was really interesting, Susie, when I started to reflect how I was feeling, especially in my early 30s, when all of a sudden I started to feel this really this shakiness, where I knew the foundation in which I built my recovery didn't quite feel as solid as perhaps I thought it once was. I realized that, I had a lot of maladaptive behaviors when I was a teenager, and I still had a lot of maladaptive behaviors, but they weren't addicted. I wasn't addicted to drugs. I was addicted to perfectionism, to
Mm.
overachieving, to performance indicators. And what had happened is I'd run so far into this recovery, trying to get so far away from this lost teenager, that I realized now I was not necessarily, again, in that place of feeling steady and kind of knowing who I was, so to speak. And I recognize, though, the difference, Susie, was when I was a teenager, we know those behaviors weren't great. But when I was an adult achieving all this external success, I was rewarded. I was congratulated. My hustle was something that was like absolutely recognized. And I achieved these great opportunities, which was beautiful. And I give thanks for it. But I realized underneath it all, I still wasn't feeling very well. And that really started me really thinking about not just resiliency and our comebacks and our bounce backs, or our stories of success. This idea is about how we do our success and how we show up in our recoveries. And that kind of question about, are we doing it in a well way? And that's very much what sparked this idea about stressing wisely.
Perfect. So who was your avatar? Who was your ideal reader, for whom you wrote Stress Wisely?
It's a great question. So Stress Quietly was really much for those persons who were curious about, there has to be a different way, because living the dream shouldn't kill us. Yet so many of us are exhausted to the point where, like, really, this is what this is all about. And just looking for something different. Because I think intuitively, people know when they're like in alignment, when they're value driven, and they're just really in that good place of balance. And I think a lot of us are trying to like strive for it or stretch for it. And we do all the things on the outside where we see success. But sometimes there's this delta between how we feel on the inside. And that very much was that person who I knew what that felt like. And I wanted to put together research informed strategies from what we learned about working with people all around the world, because people were not alone. A lot of people in very successful lives are feeling pretty lonely.
And it's so interesting as I hear you speak about everything from perfectionism to hustle and slay culture to chasing that next piece of paper that's going to, we think, give us some sort of sense of, um, validation and sense of worth. How many people who I work with every single day who have this messaging that they have brought along with them for decades throughout their careers and throughout their lives. And there is a sense that there is something out of whack, but there's not a recognition of how the messaging that's coming to them, that's either coming from their childhood experiences or their young adult experiences or the culture around them, how that is influencing every single decision that they make and every single choice. So it's really fascinating to me when we start to peel that away. And the way I describe it is chiseling concrete. This stuff that's kind of glommed onto us, whether it's limiting beliefs or it's cultural lore or it's instructions or expectations from very well meaning parents and teachers and peers. When we go on this archaeological dig of the self and start to discover our true self and get into alignment with what it is that brings us alive. So I'm curious, as you have discovered and stepped out in Stress Wisely, can you share these habits for how we can really get a handle on how to leverage stress in a very powerful and healthy way in our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I echo your sentiment. You're absolutely correct that there are so many competing forces and variables at play that sometimes it's just overwhelming. Like our lives are just so full with all of these different pushes and pulls and tugs and trying to figure out what makes sense. And that was really, again, that kind of idea with Stress Wisely is it's not about people having access to the information. It's this idea about needing perhaps some guidance around how do we discern what it is that we ought to be doing or we could be doing in the most well way. So again, I want people to live their best lives. I want them to be successful, and I want them to ensure that they're building practices and habits that by executing their lives in this particular way, that they're proud of themselves. They feel good about it. They're nurturing the things that matter most, and they know how to make what matters most. So to answer your question, I'll just do one kind of thread to pull on first. I'll
Sure.
share with you one of the big observations I see, especially for high performance, which is I think very much your audience group, is this idea of like when then. And then that's very
Mm.
much a cognitive myth or this kind of faulty belief system where we think, okay, when I get that degree, then I'm going to feel smart. When I get that report done, then I'm going to be able to relax. When my children are in that class, then I'm going to be able to exhale. Like we put all these like almost like these imaginary thresholds that, okay, we just have to cross that and then we're going to be okay. And one of the big ideas that we discovered in our research is that this is this trap that keeps people like cycling in perpetuity, that they never
Mhm.
get to a place where they actually feel caught up or feel enough or feel as though that they're doing the good work. So the first kind of big idea we did is kind of pull back and say, okay, the people who have been able to achieve these things that matter most to them, and they have this really great, integration in their lives of all the stuff that matters, what are they doing? And we looked at it from not just like that physical realm of like, okay, physically, sleep, nutrition, and exercise, but we also started to realize that they had an emotional game. Like they knew how to manage and regulate their emotions. We also recognized that they were able to like really understand themselves with that
Mm.
self-awareness. One of the other ideas we often talk about, and I think this is kind of misunderstood sometimes around self-care, Susie, is like awareness, like personal awareness, self-awareness is actually a form of self-care. When you
Yes.
actually understand yourself, you understand
Mhm.
how you are in situations, that intellectual practice. And then as we started to kind of peel back, or as you use the word, that chisel some of those big ideas, we realized that like our social, our communities, our environment, our work, our finances, and our spiritual health all contributed to people really feeling grounded and steady and could show up in a meaningful way in their lives.
So, for the person who is sitting in a puddle of stress
Mhm.
and wanting to know what is that best first step they can take, because that overachieving and perfectionist spirit and mind is going to want to believe immediately that there's going to be 40 pages of things that they have to do and do them extraordinarily well, um, which of course is just more of the same of this belief of I'm already behind.
Mhm.
So what do you recommend for the overwhelmed person who's exhausted and burned out, who's just looking for that first rung on the ladder to start to climb out?
Yeah, I love that example. So the first rung on the ladder is literally just like we have to pause. We just have to take a moment to do a check-in with ourselves and actually like open up that inner dialogue in a way, not as self-criticism, but really as self-coaching to ask yourself like, okay, so let's just take an inventory. Where are things at? And we use those 8 realms of wellness in the book. And even just to start with giving yourself a score, right? Giving yourself a score out of 10 in each of those realms. To ask yourself, okay, physically, how am I doing right now? And if we're kind of drowning in those buckets of stress, the likelihood is that score won't be very high. Emotionally, how are we feeling right now? What's the quality of our feelings like during the day? And again, I'm so mindful whenever we quantize something to a high performer, we all of a sudden we want to be perfect, right? We want to make sure we're flying the high 90s in each of those domains, but we have to use real radical honesty with ourselves because we can't be in that place of working towards our wellness if we're not being honest with ourselves. So again, first starting point, look at those 8 realms, give yourself a score, not in a judgmental way, but in a curiosity based way of being like, okay, that's really interesting. Like maybe financially, I'm like 10 out of 10, but all those other realms, wow, those scores aren't where I'd want them to be. And when we start just kind of getting some of that data, it just kind of gives us a bit of kind of insight as to, okay, what should we be thinking about and what do we need to prioritize? And I think your example of having like this laundry list of, 40 pages of things that we have to do, that's why we actually don't do anything, right? We get paralyzed. We have that kind of
Mhm.
analysis paralysis where we
Mhm.
don't even know where to go. So we just stop. But when we look at it and say, okay, what's my number one priority that I can put some energy towards in a compassionate way that's going to really allow me to start to feel better? And this big idea is that your wellness isn't as far away as people think it is. Because one good night's sleep, you're going
Mhm.
to feel better tomorrow. One really great choice about what you do to recover, or for example, what you have for breakfast, or how you get movement in your day, or talking to a good trusted friend, you're one right choice away to start feeling better right now. And we need those little wins today, not this, in 90 days, you'll notice the results. We need to have that in that moment.
Oh, I just love that so much. And I know that with the power of accumulation from these little wins, how much it steers and propels us in ways that we can't even imagine. We want to sort of fantasize that the only thing that's going to work is the I need to scale Everest by Friday approach. And of course, culture kind of reinforces that as well. But our mind tends to go to it has to be giant in order to make a difference. And what we tend to miss routinely is those little choices, those very first moments of the day. And I know in my own life, when I do what I call the 5 M's, which are morning pages, movement, meditation, moments of inspired learning, and making something, when I take just a few minutes to do those things, the entire day has a very different tone and tenor to it. It has a very different experience of time. My confidence level is completely different. My willingness to do something that is beyond what I believe is my skill set, my courage to march into the unknown, all of those things shift dramatically. And then when you string these days together like beads on a string, and you have at the end of those 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, a sort of like an 80% success rate of doing these things during the day, then you have arrived at a completely different emotional state. And those things that had sort of leveled us 60 or 90 days ago, when they show up during the day, because they always do, we kind of look at them like a little bit of an annoying gnat,
Mhm.
right? Just like, oh, I'm just going to brush that away.
Yeah.
It doesn't derail us. It doesn't just take us off track. It doesn't um, seat us out of playing and being in the arena. Um, And so it's interesting, and I think that there's a tie-in to what I'd love for you to talk about is boundaries with the self. So having this consistency to do these habits, as well as the relationship to boundaries with others, and how that's so important. Both of those are so important to how we handle stress in a healthy way.
Yeah, absolutely. So to again echo your sentiments, consistency compounds. So the benefits that we get when we consistently engage in activities that are going to lead us to our that place of wellness, we get those huge returns much more continually on an ongoing basis than if it's like this all or nothing, where it's like, I'm gonna, join the gym and I'm going to like try to hate myself healthy. After a few weeks, all of a sudden I'm not doing it again. And then we just go through this kind of that cycling behavior. So I absolutely, again, agree with what you're saying is those small, consistent steps. We start to essentially what we're doing, Susie, and this ties into your boundary question, is we're actually strengthening the relationship we have with ourselves and building trust. And a lot of us, because of how we've approached our wellness in the past, we do need to do some relationship repair with ourselves first. And those consistent practices can help nurture that relationship with ourselves. So even if you just take a moment to think about, how many promises have you broken to yourself when it comes to our wellness? So even, for example, saying like, oh, I'm tired, I'm going to go to bed early tonight. And then we then spend hours mindlessly scrolling on our phones. But we had told ourselves we were going to go to bed early because we needed our rest, yet we engaged in this numbing behavior. And again, we're not doing that and looking at that behavior with judgment or shame. We're just recognizing like we're not following through for ourselves. And something that I know, especially for my high performers, part of what's really important to their integrity is that they have follow through, that people can trust them, people can count on them. Yet a lot of us aren't doing that for ourselves. So that boundary setting and that kind of idea about discipline really is about looking after the relationship that we have with ourselves. And I'll share with you a tool when I'm doing workshops and working with persons. I often ask them, like when we're exploring the physical realm, I'll ask them, okay, if you had to give your body a score out of 10 for all of the times it's shown up for you, right? So the amount of times it's like healed, it's grown, it's even maybe even if you've had a child and you've created life, like just look at your entire life span and think about how much your body has shown up for you, even perhaps when you haven't taken very good care of it, right? How many times have we been sick, but we push through, or we have a headache and instead of drinking water, we just put some more espresso on it. Push. And if we pause, think, okay, you know what? For the most part, even through difficult seasons, our bodies show up for us. And then if we just pause and ask ourselves, okay, if the body had to give you a score, or me a score on how well it's taking care of us in terms of meeting our needs around sleep and movement and reducing stress and bringing in play and joy, all the things that we know our body needs, I don't think our bodies would give us a very good score very often. So it's, again, just that awareness of, okay, well, it keeps showing up for me. I have to show up for it. And that's where those boundaries, and again, it's that prioritization kicks in where I need to make myself a priority. And that's not selfish, it's science. Like we actually have to make sure we are taking care of the bodies that allow us to show up for others and be able to be part of community. So I think kind of that relationship repair and self is really important in that boundary conversation. And when we think about with others and those boundaries with others, it's really thinking about kind of who has access to you. So when I think about boundaries, it's not so much rules, it's like who has access to me. So for example, am I bringing in that difficult conversation I had at work? Am I bringing that into my thoughts while I'm having dinner with my children? Right. So it's this about of who has access. And I find when we start thinking about it as access or who's taking up space or using our resources, it changes how we engage with those boundaries with others.
I love it. I love the way that you spoke about self-trust and making promises to ourselves. And I know that in my own experience, every single time I make a pledge to myself, I'm gonna go on a longer hike today than I did yesterday. I'm gonna bring my journal and work on a piece that I want to write in my head. And then before I even get out of the bed, the negotiating starts,
Mhm.
right? The mind starts, nah, you just make it 20 minutes. You don't need to do that. And it's the second that starts now, I have a strategy where I stop thinking and start moving. Because if I engage in any kind of back and forth in my own mind,
Yeah.
I know who's going to win. And so if I just move and go ahead and lace up the boots and go for the hike, um, when I have kept the promise to myself, so I've not only accomplished the thing, the longer hike, the
And
healthier activity, and also the connection to my creativity and to my writing. I've kept the promise to myself. So
mhm.
it's a triple X to the 10th power win.
Yeah.
And that's how it feels, right? Whereas that slow erosion of sort of the ocean of self sabotage lapping upon the shores of our sense of self, of making and breaking promises, is completely debilitating. And I notice there's a relationship to when I'm in that mode to my lack of boundary mode with others. There's a huge correlation there. So when we strengthen this sense of self and we have more self trust, we've made and kept promises, then those people or thoughts or energies that we're wondering about, who has access to me, it becomes very clear. It's a
Yes.
hell yes or a hell no.
Yeah,
There-
absolutely.
You know.
Yeah, we often talk about that, Susie, as this idea that our thoughts are simply that they're thoughts, they're not directives. Yet, what I find so fascinating is so many people surrender their control to their thoughts, thinking that they are directions or they are directives that this is what you're supposed to do. Your thoughts, you can't control what you think. Our thoughts just pop into our head. It's like popcorn in a frying pan. You don't even know which ones are going to pop or those kernels are going to pop first. Ideas always are popping into our mind. The idea is what do we do with them? So again, just because we think it, that doesn't mean it's a directive. So I'll give you an example. Is let's say you're getting up and going for that hike, and all of a sudden you're like, oh well, it's cold outside, right? It's like, yes, it's cold outside. Or perhaps it's like, I don't have time for this. It's like, no, that's just a thought. It's this idea like, well, no, I'm choosing to make time and maybe I'll have to shift something later, but I'm choosing to follow through with this commitment to myself. So recognizing those are just thoughts, they're not directives. We don't actually have to follow everything that we think.
Absolutely. And as the um, life of circumstances creates thoughts, and then we have those feelings, we tend to point to the circumstance as the reason why we're not feeling good. And of course, the middleman or the middle woman is always the thought that's between the two. And so I'm curious what your favorite strategies are to recommend to people when they're in a stressful time. What do you recommend as your top thing to do strategically?
Yeah. So strategically, when we're going through a complicated season, it's to do whatever we can to slow down because our nervous system, it's hardwired to, fight or flight, freeze, fawn. Like we have all this ways our bodies are going to react. And the idea is this quicker we can get to that place of just, okay, slow down and just kind of like think it through, like just do whatever that looks like. So that might be walking out of a room. That might be just a really solid exhale. It could be even just imagining your feet grinding into the floor just to like slow down, almost as if you can like reduce the speed of what's going on around you, because that's when we're going to get clarity and we'll have the most spaciousness in terms of how we choose to respond. The other strategy that I find really helpful when we're navigating a lot of noise and a lot of complexity is to first notice, we first notice it. And then that second idea is to recognize this idea that like, okay, I'm instead of saying like, I feel anxious, like I am anxious, to do that little bit of a recorrect to say, wow, I notice I'm feeling really activated right now. I
Mm.
notice I'm feeling really frantic. I notice I'm like tired and wired versus like I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, I'm so stressed. Just anytime we can put a bit of spaciousness helps with the slowing down. And the other strategy or tactic I find that works well is to recognize like part of me is really anxious right now. Part of me is tired. Part of me is feeling overwhelmed or scared or nervous. Part of me is worried, because as long as you start recognizing that it's not all or nothing again, where it's like, I am completely overwhelmed. It's like, wow, part of me is feeling overwhelmed. What that does again is it creates space for that really functional part or your higher self to be able to say, yeah, I noticed that thinking is helping, making me feel anxious, but I'm the thinker, I'm not the thought. So I'm going to engage, I'm going to act, I'm going to respond, I'm going to do something to try and bring myself back to that place of balance and that place of groundedness. So, often I'll even say to, my children, I have 3 teenagers and we'll talk about this, like, part of me does not feel like making dinner. Like part of me does not feel like doing this, or, part of me doesn't do it. But the thing is, I know that the higher self, the wise is part of me, will do it because they know it needs to get done. So just putting things into parts versus all and just getting spaciousness in our language is a great starting point.
I love it. I love this adding spaciousness and slowing down and separating ourselves a little bit from the whirling emotions and the thoughts. And I'm curious if you have a creative practice that you engage in that helps you do that. This is why making something for me is not only a wonderful way to tap into my intuition and my imagination and my ideas and my problem solving, but it is my opportunity to step into that river of spaciousness and lose myself in this world of color and mark making and writing words, etc. So tell me a little bit about a creative practice that you might have.
Yeah, I love that question. And I love all of your work in that realm. So thank you for doing that and asking. So
Thank
for
you.
me, what's really important is to make the invisible visible. And I think often as high performers and intellectual persons, we try to like outthink our problems, right? We try to think ourselves into creativity. We try to, think ourselves into reason. And I think what's really important is to try to have moments where we're making that invisible into something we can actually see. So for me, what's a really important strategy is to like write down those thoughts, even on Post-it notes. Like we got to get it out, whether it's through journaling, whether it's through talking with someone. But for me, I like to put kind of one idea on a Post-it note. And we have this activity that I coach teenagers actually on around like what we call our mental laundry. And we have to sort the light and the darks, right? So I want to sort the ideas that are dark. And that's not to say there's judgment as in they're good or bad. It's just recognizing that if all of these thoughts that I'm getting out on paper, if they're just really heavy and dark, what we want to make sure is that we're also making room for that way we can also have experiences or that spaciousness to activate the light, which we know helps when we're in community. It helps when we have play, music, nature, solitude, connection, all of those, beautiful forces of recovery help with those lighter feelings. So we can do it on Post-it notes. Sometimes I use Post-it notes. Other times I'll even just write it down, like just write, we call it free flow writing, where we just kind of write down everything. And then I'll just take a moment and look at that list of whatever I just put on paper and then just do like that mental laundry. Is that a dark thought or is that a light thought? And if I notice there's too many dark thoughts in there, then I make sure that I find a way to find some release. Because I think we have a propensity of just holding on too long. And as long as we just keep doing it in our mind, we don't notice that kind of buildup or that cumulative effect. But as soon as we start to realize, like, gosh, most of what's going on in my head, it's not a very nice place to be, which no wonder I don't feel great if I'm just focusing on all this darkness. And then we think about, okay, what can I do to activate that light? And for me, it's always about getting outside and music, right? So if I notice I have too many D's in that column, I make sure to strategy to get outside, and I use music as a powerful mood agent to get us out of our head, Susie, and into our heart space.
Oh, I love that. And that's such a fun and accessible strategy that everybody can start immediately. Just have a piece of paper and a pencil and some some Spotify, and you're ready to go. So I want to thank you so much for being here today. I want to ask you if there's anything about your personal journey, your professional journey, your experience writing your books, anything that you'd like to share that you believe is sort of the um, un, unknown secrets to how to stress wisely.
Yeah, so that's a huge question. The idea, the thread that I would pull on, and I think that this is this idea of knowing who you are and knowing who you are not, knowing who you want to be and knowing what you don't want to do. And I'll share with you what was really the catalyst, because I had a very structured career in the academy, in the university setting, that, I knew my retirement date when I was like 27, right? Like on a piece of paper, I knew in 2050, like my life was so concrete, which brought this beautiful element of stability, which I appreciated. And I realized that I'd kind of shut off that creative part, or that idea of seeing myself any differently. And I'll share with you, this really transformational moment happened probably about 6 years ago, when my oldest son, at the time, he would have been 13. We were having a chit chat, and I was going through a very difficult season in my kind of university work, and had a very challenging supervisor. And I remember Hunter saying to me, he said, "Mama," he said, "you told me I could be anything I wanted when I grow up." He said, "You told me if I work hard and, I make good choices, and I could really, really activate and be whatever I want to be when I grow up." And I said, "Yes, Hunter, that's absolutely true." And he said, "Why can't you? Like, why can't you? You want to be a writer? You want to help people? You don't want to be in these like bricks and mortar buildings of a university. Like, you want to be in community. Like, why can't you do those things?" And I just had this moment, Susie, where I realized, why not me? And if I had been sharing this with my children, and I wanted to be genuine and authentic, and really encouraging my children to kind of go out and find their place and space in the world, I realized that I was staying in that kind of safe zone, which I understand why we do it. And I recognize that this isn't actually how I wanted to spend the next 30 years of my career.
Those chillin', they speaketh the truth, don't they?
Absolutely. Our greatest teachers. Yeah. So for folks listening, that would be my invitation. Why not you? Like, why not? Why can't you be what you want to be as a grown up?
I'll tell you the one of the many zingers that my son lobbed my way that completely changed my life. What the first one was, "Mom, how come you're not playful anymore?" And I was just like, I had to sit down. I was like, I need a minute to think about this. It had such a powerful effect on how I started to change everything in my life. It's fascinating how they just go right to the marrow of the issue. Well, thank you so much for being here. Could you please share with folks the best way to learn more about you and get in touch with you if they'd like to work with you?
Well, thank you again for having me. And the best
Yes.
way is just through social media or the website, which is Dr. Robyne, ROBYNE .ca. And I would welcome these conversations to continue. Thank you, Susie.
Well, thank you so much. And Dr. Robyne's books are available wherever books are sold. Highly encourage you to go shopping and learn how to stress wisely, as well as build more resiliency into your life, a lot more playfulness and joy, and of course, the greatly needed spaciousness. So, thank you all for joining us today. Dr. Robyne, thank you again. And my mind is going 100 miles an hour in a very good way. And I appreciate you so much and appreciate all the work that you're doing in the world. So thank you all for coming, and let us know if you have any questions. Feel free to email me at susie@innovationcompass.com. And again, you can find Robyne's books wherever books are sold. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.